So we did have one other question come in from Janelle, asking, she has a few pastures that have no shade and has thought of purchasing fast-growing Australian trees to get shade. Has anyone worked with those, or does anyone have any experience with those?
If she's talking about the ones I'm thinking about, they're called Oz trees. They're hybrid willow tree. I've seen people plant them in windbreaks and stuff in North Idaho. They seem to do fine. Most trees in that family, poplars and willows, all grow pretty quickly as young trees. So if the goal is shade and you have sufficient moisture, I can imagine it could be good.
So I have a comment to Camilla. I believe it's Camilla. She makes a comment that she has no trees and would like to have some orchard trees and nuts and such. So what I would suggest is, when you make your overall plan, don't try to have the animals right exactly under the trees. Have like on the west side, because more of the afternoon sun that you're trying to get out of, you're trying to create shade. So to the west and south of certain areas, like you can make some patches or islands out in your pasture and then fence those so that the animals don't get to your trees, but the long rays of the sun will be blocked by those trees as they get bigger. It goes back to the idea of a row or a band of trees and having it separate, so that then you have the opportunity to have orchards and also provide shade.
Great, that's awesome. So I think we're moving on to our group discussion and Q&A. So if there are any other questions related to any parts of today's program, feel free to put them in the Q&A box or in the chat.
I do remember that there was one question in the chat earlier that was talking about anybody weighing in and having any experience with manure spreaders that were not PTO driven, that you could use a ATV or a small or something or other to pull it with. And I don't know if anybody has any experience with that. We had a PTO driven manure spreader, which was fantastic. It was a really great way to get our solve two problems at once. Get rid of our manure and fertilize the pasture.
Well, I've had some failed attempts, and I could talk about the failed attempts. They have this thing that looks really cool where you put it in the back of a pickup truck, and it's like a window shade lying in the base of your back of your pickup truck, and you put all your horse manure on there, drive it over, and then turn the crank, and suddenly all your manure is spread so nicely. Well, that doesn't work really. I found it to be a waste of money, and it's far too heavy, and it breaks the thing. So I wouldn't try that. What works probably the best is to get a really old funky trailer and put all the manure in there and just drive slowly with an ATV and rake it out.
Awesome. We have a question about mowing pastures. Do we need to mow pastures, or assuming you stock correctly, will the animals do it for you?
Animals will do it for you.
Yeah.
I have a comment on that. It is a good way to stockpile grass for later, and rather than having it get too mature. And when we had, like I said, a sub-irrigated pasture in the Palouse, the grass would get really long, and it worked really well to kind of even it out. And then the grass that was fairly mature would be lying in windrows, and the cattle absolutely loved to eat it out of the windrow. So we talk about stockpiling and things like that in great detail in the Lost Rivers Grazing Academy 4-day workshop, which I think both Samantha and Rebecca have been to that as well.
Yes, it's fantastic. I came home so excited to grow grass to feed cows. So excited. And they gave us our own cows every day. It was fantastic. It kind of relates though to the question in the chat from Carly. So I live in a rangeland situation where I don't have irrigated pastures. And at the Grazing Academy, we were talking about how we're grass farmers first. Before we're even cattle farmers or sheep meat growers, all those things, because we got to grow the grass to feed the cows. And I said, well, what about me? I get rain a little, kind of. And so the answer was, yes, you can still do rotational grazing, but it depends so much on being able to know what's growing and watching your rain levels and making sure you don't overgraze those pastures. And your grazing periods will just be, or your rest periods after grazing might have to be a lot longer because you're waiting on the rain to regrow your crop to go back in there. So it does change your rotations. You might have to have bigger paddocks because you don't have as much feed in that area for depending on how many animals you want to have. So you have to give them more space to graze. And then you might have to incorporate longer rest periods to give the grasses opportunity to grow if you're waiting on rain. I don't know if Samantha wants to add to that.
May I comment on
Yeah.
that too? Yeah, I think, Samantha, you make a really good point. And if you think about the original rotational grazing, it's in the savanna or in the steppes or in the North American prairies. And the animals come through in a great mob, very, very high density of population of animals, of mixed species. And they eat what is extra, and then they move on and they don't come back to that area for a long while until it's ready to and it supports a lot of abundant wildlife. But it's shocking to see the mob come in and eat so much and then move on. It's shocking for a few minutes to look at that landscape, but in fact that's how it's designed to grow.
And for me on a small acreage, thinking about, okay, so, my dream might have always have been mother cows to run pairs. Well, that might not actually be the best thing for my grazing options that I have. It might be better for me just to be a feeder. Maybe I buy calves at the auction and grow them on what grass I have and then sell them and be done, because that's a better use of my resource. So you might have to readjust your goals or your plans based on what your resources are to actually match those two up better. And the question in the question answer about magic number of paddocks, I believe that would be no. There's not a magic number.
Yeah, I just answered. It all depends what type of livestock you have, how many livestock you have, how big of land you have that you're going to put into rotational grazing, how many times you want to move livestock, how often you want to move them.
I would say it goes back to that watching your grass grow, because you're a grass farmer, essentially. You got to see what the regrowth time is, and then maybe add a couple of days and have that many or close to that many individual places to graze so that they can come back around. If you can only, because of your work schedule, you can only leave them on there for 4 days, it will be less than optimal compared to 2 days. But you'll figure out from the regrowth. The regrowth tells you everything about how often you need to go back on it. In the springtime, it may be different. In the spring, I can have some areas that regrow in 10 days and some that grow in 20 days. But later in the fall or in the late August, the regrowth time can be 40 days on some parcels.
That's an excellent answer. This is and it's such a good question. It I teach at the Lost Rivers Grazing Academy, and I just teach the financial management portion, but I love it so much because it's really hands-on. Like you said, you get an assignment of a team of cattle, and it's on irrigated pasture. So I always wanted to bring that to our rain-fed pasture, and the instructors assure me the principles are the same. I mean, you can do this in California with a very extreme Mediterranean climate. You can do it where you are in North Idaho with a Mediterranean climate. You just need to watch and observe and calculate and, observe your pastures, observe your animals. And but it's always going to be depending, it's hard to do it perfectly, I think.
That's great. Carly also asked, I think for you, Kate, you mentioned sub-irrigation, and can you explain a little more what that is?
Okay, so when we had about 15 acres in the Palouse between Colfax and Pullman, and it was a piece of ground that was had a seasonal creek running through it, and was very wet, and plus all the surrounding hills had been tiled to drain into that bottomland. And so it wasn't good for grain farming. It was good for pastures, but it also tended to be kind of flooded. So it was naturally wet is basically what I mean by sub-irrigated, sometimes too wet. And what I ended up doing was, the more I could cross fence it or use electronet, which was my favorite tool. If you don't know what that is, it's basically this net that's very portable. You can get it in different lengths. I think I had 300-foot lengths, and it is I think 4-inch squares is what at the top, and maybe smaller than that at the bottom. So kind of like field fencing. You can get different heights, and it's got the electrical, it's an electric net in there so that it gives the animals a shock. But it's got little built-in stakes every 10 or 12 feet, and you can easily pick it up and then spread it back out again and move it all around. So I use that to keep the animals off the real wet areas, and I used it for a ton of things. And it also was a deterrent to critters getting in there. So if you haven't checked out electronet and you're wanting to do this, I think Tess uses it a lot as well.
Yeah, Kate, that's a really good point. The best educational source that I found for electronet fencing is a company called Premier One, as the numeral 1, Supply. And they have a book called Fences That Work by People Who Use Them. And it explains everything you would ever want to know about using electrical fencing for livestock. It's so clear, and it tells you it's not just a sales tool, and I'm not being a promotion for them, but it's a very educational, and it's free. They'll send it out to you. It's called Fences That Work by People Who Use Them.
I second that. It is a very good resource for 10 Acres and a Dream. In fact, it might be in our bibliography somewhere. If not, it should be.
I will do a little more digging to try to find that and make sure that it's included.
So there's
in
a
our resources.
There's a question that I think might refer to that fencing. Do you have to keep weeds and grass off the fencing? Yeah, you do. Yeah, it's it doesn't it doesn't get grounded out super easily. It can tolerate a bit, but you're going to have to weed whack and move it to areas that have been cleared off a bit.
I like to comment on that too. The measure of how much an energizer, how much snap there is, or how much jolt there is measured in joules, Joules. And if you're kind of trying to contain, a ram, or you're trying to go through a lot of distance, or you have weeds, you might have to use more joules, more jolt there. And if you look at that book about fences that work, it will explain the different kinds of electronet fencing that are more appropriate to use if you have drier areas or if you have high grass areas. In general, what Kate says is absolutely true. You have to not have tall grass there, but there are differences that you can do in your choices of the energizer and the choice of the kind of fence that can make your life a lot easier. And it may seem expensive at first, but when you take into account your time and how much more use you're going to get out of your land, it's so worth it.
And the electronet is really good for poultry as well. Here's another question. I am the one who is letting my pasture grow this season to reseed itself. If I want to mow for aesthetics, when would that be best to do? This fall, next spring, or not at all? I've also thought about frost seeding this winter, since I have a bag of meadow brome I'd like to use up anyway. Would I want to mow before I do that? Well, we used to mow when it started to get real tall and not real palatable, and that just made the pasture, it looked a lot better after being mowed, but mowed fairly high, and then it allows the grass to kind of rejuvenate and become more palatable. Frost seeding is a great technique to use, and you probably don't need to mow it first because you're going to do that in the winter or early spring.
I've had a lot of luck frost seeding white Dutch clover, and it really adds just that little bit more of legume nitrogen fixing that will make your whole season better. I'm not sure about meadow brome.
I think that would work fine, frost seeded. Another thing that is taught at the Livestock Grazing Academy is to have legumes in your grass and to have a lot of different species. And it's a fascinating topic. So I don't know, maybe you can speak to that, Tess.
Well, I find that if I get just enough white Dutch clover, it seems to enhance the grass production. And I'm assuming that that is because it enhances the nitrogen. And timing is everything. Remember, I had that slide about knowing which grasses are in, this cold season and which are the warm season. That might be a little bit less in southern Idaho, but actually, their seasons are very significant for which species of grass grows at which time in a habitat. Samantha, maybe you have something to add on that.
Nothing in addition to what I talked about in my presentation.
Yeah.
Just to have some, and then deciding how much you want. And it talked about the different percentages in the presentation if they want to refer to that.
I know we have some good publications in the U of I website and in our resources on that. And one thing that is always such a good practice, grass requires a lot of nitrogen. So if it's a good idea to do a soil test, but and then say this is a grass pasture and get a recommendation. That way you're not just guessing. And there's lots of resources for doing soil testing. And you can get such an incredible boost in your grass production if it needs nitrogen and you give it nitrogen. It can be probably one of the most cost-effective things you can do.
So Mackenzie, Tess here. I'm not sure if it's just their digital catalog at Premier One, or if it's a specific book or booklet, I should say, that says fences that work.
Yeah,
Because
so if you go to that link that I put in the chat, the very first thing that I see is 2020 Fences That Work digital catalog. But then there's some other resources that might be helpful as well. There's an equipment catalog, poultry solutions, a few other things that I thought might be helpful. So that's all there.
Thank you.
Yeah, and there's also a button that you can request a free catalog to be sent to you if you are someone who prefers to have a physical copy.
There's lots of good information in the chat. So Mackenzie, are you going to, does that get preserved somehow?
It does, and I can pull out some of the links to put on the resources page.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
I see
absolutely.
a question from Carly. I live in the Palouse where people generally don't irrigate. How does that change rotational grazing pros and cons compared to Southern Idaho? I'm not sure if we addressed that. I think maybe we already did.
Yes, that was already answered.
Okay.
Great. Well, if there's any last questions, folks can put those in the chat or the Q&A. But I don't see anything at the moment.
And you can always contact us later on if something occurs to you. So
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. There's lots of great resources and people who can help connect you to those. Awesome. Well, Kate, if you want to advance to the next slide, we can do a bit of wrap up and talk about the end of course survey. Awesome. We really appreciate you all being part of this program, and we hope that you have taken away some valuable information from all three or a handful of the workshop days we've had this month. At the end of this webinar, when you close out of Zoom, it will launch a window for taking our end of workshop survey. This is really helpful for us to know how we can make our delivery of programs like this better in the future. So if you would take a few minutes to complete that, we would really appreciate it. It is really valuable information for us. Like the rest of the workshop days, you'll be able to find a recording of today's workshop, the slide handouts, and then also a list of the resources that we've been talking about and some supplemental resources and handouts as well that will be available to you all early next week. I would also encourage you to sign up for the Cultivating Success newsletter that goes out every other week, and that's a really good way to stay connected to different resources and different programs that are happening online and hopefully eventually in your areas as well. So thank you all so much. I have really enjoyed being part of this program.
thank you to everyone who participated, and thank you for all the speakers. Mackenzie, thank you for your fantastic technical support and guidance and instructions. So everybody, thank you for attending, and we really would appreciate you taking a few moments to complete the survey. That will help us in the future. And stay safe, and thanks again.
Thank you all. Have a great weekend.
Goodbye.